My name is Sierra Vaughn, and I am 35 years old. My world shattered into 1,000 pieces at Rome's airport not because of a natural disaster, but because of a single no to my own flesh and blood. Standing in the middle of Fiumicino, I watched my life's stability vanish in a single violent rip of paper. The sound of the ticket tearing was like a gunshot in the crowded terminal. My mother Martha looked at me with eyes colder than the marble floors, her face twisted in a mask of calculated rage. All because I refused to wire $50,000 into her personal account to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle. "You'll find your own way home, Sierra. Perhaps a little hunger will teach you gratitude," she spat. With a flick of her wrist, she turned and walked toward security, followed by my father Gary and my sister Valerie. They didn't just leave me. They had strategically taken my passport, my phone, and my wallet earlier that morning. I was stranded in a foreign country with zero resources, completely erased by the people who were supposed to love me most. As I stood there trembling and breathless, a man with the unmistakable aura of immense power approached. He leaned in, his voice a low, commanding whisper that cut through my panic. "Pretend you're my wife. My driver is waiting at the curb. Trust me, Sierra. They are going to regret every step they just took." It was Julian Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with billions in Silicon Valley, and in that moment, he became my only hope for survival and my ultimate weapon for revenge. Before I reveal the calculated plan we used to dismantle my family's greed and reclaim my life, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, share your story. In the comments below, you are not alone, and justice is coming. The heavy scent of jet fuel and expensive leather filled my senses as Julian Sterling guided me toward a sleek, matte black Gulfstream idling on the private tarmac. I climbed the stairs with trembling legs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Stepping inside was like entering a different dimension, where the crushing weight of my family's betrayal couldn't reach me. The cabin was a sanctuary of polished walnut cream-colored silk and silence so thick it felt tangible. Julian gestured for me to sit in a captain's chair that cost more than my parents' entire SUV. He didn't offer me comfort or a shoulder to cry on. Instead, he handed me a glass of sparkling water and sat across from me, his sharp gray eyes dissecting my every breath. The engines began to hum, a low vibration that signaled the start of my transformation. You're wondering why Julian said, his voice cutting through the cabin's pressurized air. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, which I appreciated. "I saw what happened back there, Sierra. I saw the way your mother looked at you. Not like a daughter, but like a nuisance she had finally managed to discard. I don't help people out of the goodness of my heart. I help people who have something I need." I leaned back, trying to mask the fact that I was a woman who currently owned nothing but the clothes on her back. He explained the situation at Sterling Tech, his massive empire in Silicon Valley. Following the passing of his late wife a year ago, the board of directors had become restless, whispering that he was distracted and emotionally compromised. His younger brother was already whispering in the ears of the shareholders, painting Julian as a liability to the company's stock price. He needed a wife, a steady, sophisticated partner who could project an image of stability and traditional values to silence the vultures. "I need someone who isn't part of my world," Julian continued, leaning forward. "Someone without a trail of social media scandals or a thirst for my bank account. You are a ghost right now, Sierra. You have no phone, no identity in this country, and a family that has effectively erased you. That makes you the perfect candidate for a strategic alliance." I took a slow sip of the water, the coldness grounding me. It was a cold, hard business deal disguised as a rescue mission. I looked at him, realizing that for the first time in my life, I was being valued for my utility rather than my obedience. I told him he was right, but I also had my own set of vultures to deal with back in California. My grandmother, a woman of immense foresight, had established a trust fund for me worth $5 million. It was set to vest on my 36th birthday, which was only 3 weeks away. Martha and Gary, my parents, had spent decades bleeding me dry, but they knew they couldn't touch that principle unless I was declared legally unfit to manage my own affairs. That was the real reason for the trip to Rome. They didn't just want to abandon me, they wanted to create a paper trail of erratic behavior in a foreign country to build a case for legal guardianship. By leaving me stranded without a passport or a way home, they were setting the stage to tell the courts in San Francisco that I had suffered a mental breakdown and disappeared. If they succeeded, they would gain full control of the $5 million before the month was out. Julian listened, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of dark amusement crossed his face when I mentioned the dollar amount. "So we both have a common enemy," he mused, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "Greed. Your parents want your inheritance, and my board wants my chair. We provide each other with the perfect shield." He promised me the best legal team in the country to fight the guardianship filing, but, in return, I had to play the role of the devoted fiancée and future Mrs. Sterling. I had to be flawless, untouchable, and convincing enough to make the world believe he had found love again. I agreed without hesitation. The Sierra Vaughn who had cried on the airport floor was dead. This new Sierra was a partner to a titan fueled by a cold, burning need for restitution. The long flight across the Atlantic was spent in a flurry of documents and strategy. Julian's assistants, who seemed to materialize from the shadows, provided me with a temporary phone and a wardrobe that screamed old money. As the hours ticked by, the fear that had paralyzed me turned into a sharp, focused weapon. We weren't just flying home, we were preparing for a declaration of war. By the time the pilot announced our descent into San Francisco International Airport, the city lights below looked like a sea of diamonds waiting to be claimed. I watched the Golden Gate Bridge appear through the darkness, a gateway to the life I was about to seize back. We landed softly on the private runway, the clock on my $5 million inheritance ticking louder than ever. The morning fog in San Francisco clung to the streets like a cold, damp blanket as I stepped out of the black sedan Julian had arranged for me. I didn't head straight to a hotel or a familiar place where I might be recognized. My first stop was a small, inconspicuous cafe tucked away in a quiet residential neighborhood on the city's outskirts. I wore a nondescript trench coat and large sunglasses, feeling like a fugitive in my own hometown. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, a mundane scent that felt jarring against the high-stakes chaos of my life. Cynthia was already waiting in a corner booth, her fingers nervously drumming against a thick manila envelope. She was my cousin, the only one in the entire Vaughn clan who didn't look at me as a potential bank account or a stepping stone. When she saw me, her eyes widened in a mix of terror and profound relief. She didn't say a word. She simply slid the envelope across the sticky table. I opened it, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The documents inside were a meticulously crafted death warrant for my independence. My father, Gary, had pulled every string in his professional network to file an emergency petition for legal guardianship. The paperwork included eyewitness accounts from my sister Valerie and my mother Martha, claiming I had been showing signs of severe psychological instability for months. They had even procured a fraudulent evaluation from a private physician detailing acute paranoid episodes and financial recklessness. According to these papers, I wasn't just missing. I was a woman who had suffered a complete mental collapse in Rome and was a danger to her own well-being. The goal was chillingly clear. They were seeking full control over my medical and financial decisions, specifically targeting the $5 million that was supposed to vest in my name in less than 3 weeks. The sheer level of premeditation made my stomach churn with a sickening realization. The trip to Italy had never been about a family vacation or mending our fractured relationships. It was a staged event, a carefully choreographed theater of betrayal. By taking my passport and leaving me stranded, Gary and Martha had created the perfect proof of my supposed breakdown and subsequent disappearance. They were probably in court right now pretending to be heartbroken parents who had lost their daughter to a mental crisis while secretly salivating at the thought of Grandma's trust fund finally being within their grasp. The $5 million had always been the prize. My parents didn't see me as their child. They saw me as the final hurdle between them and the lavish lifestyle they felt they deserved, but could no longer afford on their own. I felt a cold, sharp anger crystallizing in my chest, replacing the lingering ache of sadness that had haunted me since the airport. I looked at Cynthia, whose face was pale with worry as she whispered the rest of the news. She told me that Gary had already started talking to real estate agents about selling my private condo, claiming it was necessary to liquidate assets to pay for my eventual long-term care. They weren't even waiting for the court's final word before they started carving up my life like a trophy. The audacity of their greed was almost impressive if it wasn't so sociopathic. I reached into my bag and pulled out a notebook starting a list. It wasn't just a list of facts. It was a blacklist. I wrote down the name of the doctor who signed the fake evaluation, the family friends who had provided false statements, and the lawyers Gary was using to bypass the standard legal protections. Every name on that paper was a debt that would be settled with interest. I told Cynthia that I wasn't going to just show up and prove I was sane. That would be too easy, and Gary would just find another way to attack my reputation. No, I was going to let them think their plan was working. I would stay in the shadows hidden behind Julian's immense influence, while we gathered the evidence to prove that this wasn't just a family dispute, it was a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit fraud and identity theft. I wanted Gary to stand in that courtroom confident and smug, and I wanted to be the one who pulled the rug out from under him in front of the judge. Cynthia leaned in, her voice trembling. "They're dangerous, Sierra. Gary has put everything on the line for this. He is drowning in debt, and he needs that $5 million to save his own skin." I looked at her and realized that my father's desperation was his greatest weakness. A desperate man makes mistakes, and Gary Vaughn was about to make the biggest mistake of his life by underestimating the daughter he had tried to discard. I tucked the forged documents back into the envelope, feeling a strange sense of calm. The Sierra who craved her mother's love had died on the floor of the Rome airport. The woman sitting in this diner was a stranger to them, a ghost with a billionaire ally, and a thirst for justice that no amount of money could quench. As I walked out into the San Francisco morning, the fog didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like cover. I contacted Julian's security team to pick me up, my mind already racing through the next steps of our counterattack. I had the documents, I had the motive, and I had the backing of a man who played the game of power better than Gary could ever dream. The Vaughn family thought they had erased me from the map, but all they had really done was give me the freedom to tear their world apart. I wasn't just going to get my inheritance back. I was going to make sure that by the time I was finished, the name Vaughn would be synonymous with nothing but disgrace. The battle for my life had moved from the runways of Italy to the courtrooms of California, and I was more than ready to win. The transformation from a discarded daughter to a Silicon Valley powerhouse began within the minimalist confines of Julian's Woodside estate. I spent the first 48 hours surrounded by a team of elite stylists and media consultants who treated my reinvention as a high-stakes corporate merger. My old travel-worn clothes were replaced by structured silk dresses in shades of slate and charcoal garments that felt less like fashion and more like tactical armor. Every detail was curated to project an image of effortless authority, a stark contrast to the unstable and paranoid woman my parents were currently describing in their legal filings. Julian watched this metamorphosis with a quiet, analytical intensity, providing me with detailed briefings on every member of the Sterling Tech Board of Directors. I wasn't just learning names and faces. I was memorizing vulnerabilities and alliances, treating my new role as Julian's fiancé with the same professional rigor I had once applied to my career as an event coordinator. The first crack in our carefully constructed facade appeared during a private dinner at a members-only club in Palo Alto where I encountered Marcus Sterling. Julian's younger brother was a man who radiated a slick, superficial charm that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. As Julian stepped away to take an urgent call from a major investor, Marcus leaned toward me, his voice a low, venomous drawl. He didn't bother with the pleasantries of a future brother-in-law. Instead, he casually mentioned that he had recently shared a very productive phone call with a man named Gary Vaughn. Marcus hinted that my father was quite concerned about my sudden recovery and was willing to share certain medical records that could make Julian's engagement look like a PR disaster. It was a direct threat, a clear sign that my father was already looking for allies within Julian's own camp to ensure I stayed silenced, and the $5 million stayed within his reach. I didn't flinch or offer him the satisfaction of a defensive reply. I simply smiled, adjusted my Cartier watch, and told Marcus that I hoped he had a very talented legal team because the fallout from associating with a man under federal investigation for fraud would be catastrophic for his career. The tension between our two camps reached a boiling point 3 days later during the Sterling Initiative Gala, a black tie fundraiser designed to showcase Julian's latest breakthroughs in sustainable technology. This was my territory, the kind of event where I had built my reputation before my family began their campaign to dismantle my life. However, 2 hours before the doors opened, a crisis erupted that threatened to destroy Julian's standing with the international press. The digital keynote presentation, the centerpiece of the entire evening, had been mysteriously corrupted, and the main catering firm, a company with deep ties to Marcus Sterling, suddenly claimed a logistical failure and refused to deliver the main course for 500 high-profile guests. Julian's chief of staff was in a state of near paralysis, but I felt a familiar, sharp focus take hold of me. I knew exactly what this was: a coordinated attempt by Marcus and Gary to humiliate us on a global stage, proving I was a liability rather than an asset. I didn't waste time on blame or panic. I went straight into crisis management mode, utilizing the resources Julian had placed at my disposal. I contacted a high-end boutique catering service I had worked with years ago in San Francisco, leveraging a personal favor to have an artisanal menu prepared and delivered within 90 minutes. While the food was being reorganized, I sat down with Julian's lead software engineer, bypassing the corrupted files and pulling the raw data from the secure backup servers to rebuild the keynote presentation from scratch. I stayed behind the scenes, barking orders and coordinating logistics with a level of precision that left Julian's seasoned staff in awe. When the doors finally opened and the guests began to arrive, the atmosphere was seamless and sophisticated, with not a single hint of the chaos that had transpired backstage. The evening was an undisputed triumph, culminating in a keynote speech that sent the company's stock price soaring in after-hours trading. Julian stood on the stage, the perfect image of a visionary leader, but his eyes kept finding me in the back of the ballroom. Later, as the last of the limousines pulled away and we stood in the quiet, flower-scented air of the venue, he didn't talk about the money or the board members. He took a long look at me, his usual mask of cold indifference finally slipping to reveal a profound sense of respect. He admitted that he had expected me to be a decorative piece in his game, a passive victim in need of a shield. Instead, I had proven to be the sharpest blade in his arsenal. For the first time, our alliance felt like something more than a cold transaction. It was a partnership of equals, two people who had been underestimated by their own blood and were now ready to strike back. As we drove back to Woodside, the city lights reflecting off the hood of the car, I felt a surge of genuine confidence. My father and Marcus had tried to use my professional background against me, thinking they could break me by sabotaging the very things I was good at. They didn't realize that they had only succeeded in reminding me of my own strength. The $5 million was no longer just an inheritance I was trying to protect. It was the fuel for the fire that would eventually consume Gary and Martha's carefully constructed lies. I was no longer the girl who had been left behind in Rome. I was a strategist, a survivor, and I was about to show my family exactly what happens when you try to erase a woman who knows her own value. The battle lines in Silicon Valley were drawn, and for the first time I knew I was the one holding all the winning cards. The glass and steel atrium of the Sterling Tech headquarters shimmered under the strategic glow of 1,000 sapphire-toned LED lights for the global launch of the new AI interface. I moved through the crowd with a calculated grace, the heavy silk of my floor-length midnight blue gown rustling against the polished floor, a visual testament to the stability and power I now commanded. Julian remained by my side, his hand a warm, constant presence on the small of my back, signaling to every investor and journalist in the room that I was his equal partner. However, the carefully curated atmosphere of innovation and prestige was suddenly punctured by a disturbance near the main entrance. I didn't need to turn around to know who had arrived. I could feel the familiar toxic energy of the Vaughn family long before they came into view. They had leveraged Marcus Sterling's influence to bypass the guest list, marching into the gala like a group of conquerors coming to claim their prize. Valerie led the charge looking spectacularly out of place in a vibrant crimson gown that I recognized immediately from a boutique I used to frequent in San Francisco. It was a dress that cost nearly $10,000, purchased with the emergency credit card I had forgotten to cancel before the Rome disaster. She preened under the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, unaware that her presence was being monitored by a dozen security cameras. Behind her, Martha and Gary followed, their expressions a chilling mixture of feigned concern and predatory intent. They didn't come to celebrate. They came to execute the final stage of their plan. As the music dimmed for the main presentation, Martha suddenly broke from the crowd, her voice rising in a practiced theatrical wail that echoed throughout the vast atrium. She began to call my name, her face contorting into a mask of fake heartbreak as she clutched at the sleeves of a nearby journalist. "Sierra, darling, please come back to us," Martha cried, her voice amplified by the stunned silence of the room. "We've been searching everywhere for you since your breakdown in Italy. You're not well, honey. You need professional help, not a spotlight." Gary moved toward the stage with a deceptive look of fatherly authority, holding up a folder of the same forged medical documents Cynthia had warned me about. He started shouting to the crowd that I was a fugitive from my own family's care, a woman who had suffered a severe psychological collapse and was being manipulated by Julian Sterling for corporate gain. It was a masterful performance designed to destroy my credibility in front of the world's most influential tech moguls. If they could provoke me into a screaming match or a tearful breakdown right here, their legal petition for guardianship would be signed by a judge before sunrise, and the $5 million would be theirs. I didn't scream, and I certainly didn't cry. I watched them from the elevated stage with a detachment that seemed to unsettle Gary more than any angry outburst ever could. Julian leaned toward the microphone, but I gently placed a hand on his arm, stepping forward to take control of the situation myself. I signaled to the tech booth at the back of the room, where Julian's elite security team had been waiting for my cue. Suddenly, the massive panoramic screens behind me, which were supposed to show the new AI branding, flickered and changed. Instead of corporate logos, the screens began to play a series of high-definition recordings. There was no sound at first, just the visual of Gary and Martha sitting in a lawyer's office in San Francisco, laughing as they reviewed the forged psychiatric reports, while I was still stranded in Rome. The room went deathly silent as a clear, crisp audio recording began to play over the gala's state-of-the-art sound system. It was a phone call Julian's team had intercepted between Gary and Marcus Sterling. My father's voice filled the atrium loud and cold, discussing how they would split the $5 million once I was successfully committed to a private facility. He spoke about me as if I were a piece of livestock, a nuisance that needed to be managed, for the sake of the family's social standing. The betrayal was laid bare in front of 500 witnesses and a dozen live streaming cameras. Martha's theatrical tears dried up, instantly replaced by a look of sheer panicked terror. Valerie's smug expression vanished as she realized the cameras were no longer admiring her dress, but documenting her family's public execution. I stepped up to the podium, my voice calm and unwavering as it cut through the hum of the crowd. My parents are right about one thing, I said, looking directly at Gary, whose face was turning a sickly shade of gray. There has been a complete collapse of trust and a profound loss of reality. But it didn't happen to me. I detailed the events of the last few weeks, the abandonment in Rome, the theft of my identity, and the coordinated attempt to commit fraud against my grandmother's trust. I informed the room and the global audience watching online that the folder in Gary's hand was currently being reviewed by the district attorney's office as evidence in a federal investigation for identity theft and conspiracy. The security team moved in not to escort me away, but to form a wall around the Vaughn family, preventing them from fleeing before the authorities arrived. The humiliation was absolute. Gary tried to protest, to claim the tapes were deepfakes generated by our AI, but the audience had already seen enough. The venture capitalists and tech titans who had once looked at Gary Vaughn with respect now turned their backs literally and figuratively, creating a physical gap between the Vaughn family and the rest of polite society. Under the harsh, unyielding glare of the stage lights, the distinguished Gary and Martha Vaughn looked like exactly what they were: small-time con artists who had bet everything on a lie and lost. They had come to the gala to put me in a cage, but they had ended up walking into one of their own making. As they were led away by the event's security toward the back exits where the police were waiting, I didn't feel a surge of triumph, only a cold sense of closure. The mask had fallen, and for the first time in 35 years, the world saw my family for the monsters they truly were. The sirens of the police cruisers faded into the distance as the cold, clinical reality of the next phase of my life began in a private glass-walled office overlooking the Embarcadero. Julian sat beside me, the silent strength of his presence grounding me as we faced Bennett Vance, a man whose reputation as a legal shark was legendary in California's corporate circles. On the mahogany desk between us lay a stack of documents that would permanently alter the trajectory of the Vaughn family's existence. We didn't waste time with emotional reflection or celebration of the gala's outcome. Instead, we moved with a surgical precision that matched Julian's business philosophy. I picked up the heavy fountain pen and signed my name on the marriage certificate, the ink drying on a contract that granted me the legal protection of the sterling name and authorized Julian's legal team to act as my personal representatives. Bennett Vance adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the digital tablet in his hand as he initiated the first strike of our counteroffensive. With a single decisive keystroke, he activated the emergency injunctions we had prepared. One by one, the joint bank accounts that Gary and Martha had treated as their personal slush funds were frozen. I watched the status bars on the screen turn from green to red, knowing that within minutes the credit cards Valerie was using to fund her extravagant lifestyle would be declined at every luxury boutique in San Francisco. We were effectively cutting off the oxygen to the family's financial life, reclaiming the resources they had drained from me over the years. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about stripping away the power they used to manipulate and control everyone around them. As Bennett delved deeper into the financial discovery process, he uncovered a web of deception that went far beyond the theft of my identity. He revealed that Gary Vaughn had been living a lie for nearly 3 years, hiding a catastrophic series of failed high-risk investments in offshore tech startups. To cover his mounting losses, my father had secretly taken out a second and third mortgage on the family's estate in Atherton, a home that had been in our family for generations. He was currently drowning in over $4 million of debt to private lenders, and he had been counting on my $5 million trust fund to serve as his ultimate bailout. The trip to Rome and the attempt to have me declared incompetent weren't just acts of greed. They were desperate maneuvers to avoid total financial ruin and the public disgrace of bankruptcy. The sheer scale of his recklessness was breathtaking, confirming that Gary had never seen me as a daughter, but as a financial insurance policy. Bennett explained that by filing the fraudulent guardianship papers, Gary had inadvertently opened his own financial records to the scrutiny of the court, a mistake that would now be his undoing. I felt a strange sense of liberation wash over me as I realized the weight of my family's expectations was finally gone. I was no longer the one responsible for maintaining the facade of the Vaughn family's success. I authorized Bennett to move forward with a civil lawsuit for the recovery of all funds misappropriated from my accounts, ensuring that every dollar Gary had stolen to pay off his creditors would be legally clawed back into my control. Julian watched me throughout this process, his expression one of quiet approval, as he saw me transition from a survivor to a strategist. He noted that Marcus Sterling had already gone into damage control mode, distancing himself from Gary as soon as the police were involved at the gala. The alliance between my father and Julian's brother had crumbled the moment it became a liability, leaving Gary isolated and vulnerable. We weren't just winning a legal battle. We were dismantling the entire support system that had allowed Gary to thrive on lies. I told Bennett to ensure that the news of the frozen assets and the pending investigation reached the private lenders Gary owed money to. I wanted them to know that the $5 million they were expecting was now protected behind the impenetrable wall of the Sterling legal machine. The transition from being a victim of my family's greed to being the architect of their downfall felt remarkably natural. For the first time in 35 years, I felt the true meaning of freedom, the kind that comes from having the resources and the will to defend your own boundaries. I spent the rest of the night working with Bennett to secure the title to my condo, and ensuring my grandmother's trust was moved to a high-security vault that Gary could never touch regardless of any future legal maneuvers. The plan we had formed in the cabin of Julian's private jet was now a reality, and the power dynamic had shifted so completely that Gary and Martha were now the ones trapped in a foreign landscape of legal peril and financial collapse. As the sun began to rise over the San Francisco Bay, painting the water in shades of bruised purple and gold, I stood on the balcony of Julian's penthouse, breathing in the crisp, salt-tinged air. The battle was far from over, but the most dangerous part, the uncertainty, was behind me. I had a husband who respected my intellect, a legal team that was feared by the industry, and a $5 million inheritance that would now be used to build a future on my own terms. My father had tried to take my life and my sanity, but in doing so, he had only succeeded in giving me the tools to destroy him. I looked at the city below, no longer seeing a place where I had to hide, but a kingdom I was ready to reclaim. The Vaughn family had tried to erase me, but they had only ended up writing the first chapter of my greatest victory. The sun dipped low over the rolling vineyards of Napa Valley, casting long skeletal shadows across the stone terrace of Julian's private estate. I stood by the infinity pool, the air smelling of ripening grapes and cool evening mist, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the legal offices in the city. The peace of the landscape was abruptly shattered by the screech of tires on the gravel driveway as a mud-splattered SUV roared toward the main house. I didn't need to look at the security monitors to know that Gary, Martha, and Valerie had arrived, driven by the frantic desperation of predators who had finally been cornered. They pushed past the household staff, their faces etched with a mixture of arrogance and terror, and marched onto the terrace where Julian and I sat waiting. The golden hour light hit them harshly, revealing the frayed edges of their expensive clothes and the hollow exhaustion in their eyes. Gary didn't lead with an apology. He led with a snarl, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy purple as he slammed his fist against the outdoor table. He began a rambling tirade about family loyalty and the shame I was bringing upon the Vaughn name by involving federal authorities in what he called a private domestic misunderstanding. He demanded that I immediately instruct Bennett Vance to unfreeze the accounts, claiming that his creditors were now threatening his physical safety because of the missed payments on his $4 million of debt. Martha hovered behind him, her voice a sharp, high-pitched weapon, as she accused me of being brainwashed by Julian. She tried to play the role of the grieving mother one last time, weeping about how much they had sacrificed for my education and social standing. Valerie stood to the side, looking at the luxury of the Napa estate with a jealous, hungry gaze, her lips curled in a sneer as she muttered that I was nothing more than a glorified gold digger. I waited for the noise to subside my silence, acting as a heavy weight that slowly drained the air out of their frantic performance. Julian sat perfectly still, his eyes tracking their movements with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying specimen. When the terrace finally fell quiet, I pulled a thick black leather folder from beneath the table and slid it toward the center of the mahogany surface. Inside were the finalized affidavits from the doctor who had forged the psychological evaluation, along with the digital forensic reports proving that Gary had accessed my private accounts from his home computer while I was stranded in Rome. I told them very clearly that they weren't here to negotiate or to offer excuses. They were here because I was offering them one final choice before the district attorney moved forward with a formal indictment for conspiracy and grand larceny. The terms were non-negotiable and absolute. I demanded that Gary and Martha sign the legal waivers included in the folder permanently and irrevocably, renouncing any claim to my grandmother's $5 million. Furthermore, they were to sign over the deed to the Atherton house to a neutral trust with the proceeds of its eventual sale being used to repay the funds they had misappropriated from my personal savings over the last decade. In exchange, I would have my legal team provide a letter of recommendation for leniency to the prosecutor, potentially reducing their impending prison sentences to probation or community service. If they refused to sign, I would ensure that the full weight of the sterling legal machine was used to pursue the maximum possible sentence for every single charge. The $5 million was mine, and the days of the Vaughn family living as parasites on my future were officially over. The reaction was immediate and visceral, but it wasn't directed at me. It was directed at each other. As the reality of the situation sank in, the thin veneer of family unity shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Martha turned on Gary with a sudden violent fury, screaming that she had told him the Rome plan was too risky and that his stupid investments had ruined their lives. She claimed she was just a victim of his manipulation, a dutiful wife who had been misled by her husband's lies. Gary in turn erupted at Valerie, blaming her constant demands for luxury travel and designer wardrobes for the depletion of their liquid assets. He accused Martha of being the one who suggested the fraudulent guardianship in the first place, claiming he was only trying to protect what was left of their dignity. It was a pathetic, soul-crushing display of cowardice as they scrambled to throw one another under the bus to save their own skins. Valerie, seeing that her parents were no longer a source of protection or profit, turned her venom on them both, shouting that they had always been failures and that she deserved a better life than the one they had provided. The three of them began a screaming match that echoed across the quiet vineyards, a chorus of accusations and insults that proved they had never been a family at all, only a collection of selfish individuals bound together by mutual greed. I watched them and felt a profound sense of relief, realizing that the people who had abandoned me at the airport were finally seeing the true faces of the monsters they had become. There was no love left in that circle, only the bitter ash of their burned-out lies. The golden sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the terrace in a cold blue twilight as the documents remained unsigned on the table. I stood up, signaling to the security detail that the meeting was over. I gave them 60 seconds to sign the papers, or I would call the sheriff's department to have them removed for trespassing, which would trigger the immediate filing of the federal charges. Gary looked at the documents, then at the cold, unyielding faces of Julian and myself, and realized that his reign of terror had ended. With a trembling hand and a sob of pure, selfish despair, he picked up the pen and signed his name, followed closely by Martha, who didn't even look at him as she scrawled her signature on the waiver. They were no longer the powerful Vaughns of Atherton. They were just two broken, bankrupt individuals who had traded their daughter for a chance to stay out of a cage. As they slinked back to their SUV, I felt the final tether to my past snap, leaving me standing in the Napa breeze finally and completely free. The final echoes of the Vaughn family's frantic excuses disappeared into the cool night air of Napa, replaced by a silence that felt like a long overdue cleansing. In the months that followed that decisive confrontation on the terrace, the collapse of Gary and Martha's carefully manufactured empire was both swift and absolute. As the legal settlements were processed, the legendary Atherton estate was sold at auction to satisfy the millions of dollars in debt Gary had accumulated through his reckless gambling in the tech markets. I watched from a distance as they were forced to vacate the only world they had ever known, moving into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a remote suburb far from the social circles they had once dominated. Martha's social media accounts, once filled with staged photos of luxury galas and designer boutiques, went dark as the invitations dried up, and her former friends conveniently forgot her name. Valerie's fall from grace was perhaps the most public, as her involvement in the attempt to siphon funds from my trust became a cautionary tale whispered in every high-end club from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Without my credit cards to fund her vanity, her facade of influence crumbled, leaving her to face the reality of a life without the unearned privilege she had used as a weapon against me. I received a series of letters from them over those months, thick envelopes filled with tear-stained apologies and desperate pleas for one last chance to rebuild our family bond. They spoke of blood being thicker than water and the sanctity of the parent-child relationship, but I recognized the words for what they were: empty currency from people who had run out of other options. I didn't open the letters, nor did I respond to the frantic voicemails. I handed them directly to my legal team to be filed away as evidence of harassment. True forgiveness requires remorse, but what Gary and Martha felt wasn't regret for hurting their daughter, it was grief for the loss of the lifestyle they had stolen from her. I realized that some bridges aren't meant to be repaired. They are meant to be burned, so that you can use the light to find a better path forward. My inheritance, the $5 million that had caused so much bloodshed, finally vested in my name on my 36th birthday. I didn't spend it on diamonds or vengeance. I used it as the foundational capital for Vaughn Strategic Events, a high-level consultancy firm specializing in corporate crisis management and international luxury branding. Within a year, my calendar was booked with clients who valued my ability to navigate high-pressure situations with the same icy precision I had used to dismantle my own family's conspiracy. My professional success was no longer a shadow cast by the sterling name, but a beacon I had built with my own hands. Julian and I eventually sat down in that same glass-walled office where we had signed our marriage contract, but the atmosphere had shifted from tactical desperation to a profound, unspoken respect. Our strategic arrangement had served its purpose. The board of directors was silenced, and his position as CEO was more secure than ever. We agreed to dissolve the legal marriage as quietly as it had begun, but our professional collaboration remained ironclad. He became one of my firm's most significant investors, not out of a sense of obligation, but because he knew I was the best in the industry. We moved from being partners in a lie to being allies in truth, a transition that felt more intimate and honest than any romantic pretense could have ever been. The penthouse in San Francisco, which had once felt like a gilded cage where I hid from Gary's reach, became my command center. I renovated the space to reflect my own aesthetic minimalist, filled with light and devoid of the cluttered shadows of my past. I surrounded myself with a new kind of family, a circle of people chosen for their integrity, their loyalty, and their shared commitment to excellence. I learned that the traditional definition of bloodlines is often a trap used to excuse the inexcusable. The real inheritance isn't a trust fund or a deed to a house. It is the absolute freedom to define your own value and the courage to walk away from anyone who attempts to diminish it regardless of the name on their birth certificate. On a quiet evening overlooking the bay, Julian joined me on the balcony, handing me a glass of the same vintage wine we had shared during our first night on the private jet. We didn't talk about the Vaughn family or the legal battles that were now just footnotes in my history. Instead, we talked about the future, the companies I wanted to build, the lives I wanted to impact, and the peace I had finally secured for myself. I looked out at the lights of the city, feeling a sense of rebirth that was far more valuable than any bank account balance. The girl who had been abandoned at the airport in Rome with nothing but a broken heart was gone, and in her place stood a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Betrayal is a devastating teacher, but its lessons are permanent. It taught me that my peace is not a gift to be granted by others, but a territory to be defended with unyielding strength. I realized that ending a chapter forcefully is sometimes the only way to ensure the next one is worth reading. As the waves of the Pacific rolled in steadily against the shore, I felt the weight of the last few years finally lift, replaced by the weightless, intoxicating sensation of true autonomy. I had survived the fire, I had outplayed the masters of deception, and I had emerged not just intact, but triumphant. My name was Sierra Vaughn, and for the first time in my life, that name belonged entirely to me.